I've just had this fantastic conversation with Phillip Hoy and Stephen Yenser about the poetry of Anthony Hecht and James Merrill. In fact, what we did is we explored just two poems, the Book of Ephraim by James Merrill and the Venetian Vespers by Anthony Hecht. So both of them were personal friends of the poet. So Phillip Hoy has just written this wonderful book, Monsieur Degas Stecks Out, which is about a 9-second film of that he does a wonderful exploration of. And Stephen Yenser is a poet. He's written this, his most recent collection is Stone Fruit, but he's also James Merrill's executor, literary executor. So he's written this annotated version of the Book of Ephraim. So you couldn't get the better people to talk about. Both friends, both editors of the two poets' work. So you're going to love this conversation about the Book of Ephraim by James Merrill and the Venetian Vespers by the wonderful poet Anthony Hecht. I hope you enjoy it. So let's plunge in. So just to say welcome, Stephen, welcome, Phil, to PoetryEast. Really good to have you on PoetryEast. I've been very, very excited about this conversation. We've been in email conversation about it, and if we're not careful, we're going to have too much of a conversation about it. But I thought let's start with just hearing the beginning of both poems. So let's start with the first 10 lines of the Book of Ephraim, and then we'll go to the first, I thought, 9.5 lines of the Venetian Vespers, and then we'll take it from there. But let's start with you, Stephen.
Okay, I'm going to ruin your plan right away I'm going to have to read an extra 2 lines, if you don't mind. And it's very strange. James and David, his Ouija board partner, David Jackson, always pronounce the name Ephraim. And so that's what I say. You say it follows nobody else's pronunciation, not the Bible's, not anybody else's, but it's always Ephraim. So when I have to say the word, that's what I will say. Okay, here is the beginning of section A, which and all sections begin with there are 26 sections. Each begins with a letter of the alphabet. It's an abecedarian poem. Admittedly, I err by undertaking this in its present form. The boldest prose reportage was called for that would reach the widest public in the shortest time. Time, it had transpired, was of the essence. Time, the very attar of the rose, was running out. We, though, were ancient foes, I and the deadline. Also, my subject matter gave me pause, so intimate, so novel. Best, after all, to do it as a novel? I knew my setting, and had from the start a theme whose steady light shone back, it seemed, from every least detail exposed to it.
That's great, thank you.
So that is the first, the first 10 lines plus 2 of the introduction.
That's great, thank you. Let's go over. I mean, we're obviously going to talk a lot about that, but let's go over to you now, Phil, and just hear a bit of the first section of the Venetian Vespers.
Well, not the first section, the first 9.5 lines.
Yes.
Sure. What's merciful is not knowing where you are, what time it is, even your name or age, but merely a clean coolness at the temple. That, says the spirit softly, is enough for the mind to adventure on its half-hidden path, like starlight interrupted by dense trees, journeying backwards on a winter trip, while you are going, as you fancy, forward. And the stars are keeping pace with everything. Where to begin?
That's great. So, where to begin seems a good place to begin, doesn't it? So, I thought, first of all, it'd be good to start with, Stephen and you, Phil, talking a bit about your relationship to Merrill and to Hecht, and then perhaps, I know it's impossible to say it really, but say a little bit about the two poets and a bit about even a little bit of an introduction, even a bit of an overview of the poem, so that we kind of know where we're going in this conversation. So let's go over to you, Stephen. Start with you, I think, again.
Okay. Yeah. Good. I met James Merrill when he taught at the University of Wisconsin, one of the few workshops that he ever taught, and I happened to be in it. It wasn't really a workshop, but it was a wonderful opportunity to hear him talk about Elizabeth Bishop and Marianne Moore and John Barrowman in those days. And then after he left, we traded postcards, and pretty soon the postcards turned into letters. And our relationship really throughout the rest of his life was by letter, though we visited each other. I visited him in Stonington, Connecticut, and in Athens. He found me a place to live for a year in Athens, just a block from him and David. And in Europe, sometimes we would get together, but we had a very substantial correspondential, epistolary relationship. He was soon my best friend, but this was true with, I think, many people that James knew. He became best friends. He was such a mentor for me. And such a help in so many ways. But this was true with him and other people too. And we were friends right up until his death in 1995. The poem, Pound says someplace that Dante's Commedia is really a lyric. He talks about it being subjective Dante, and he says that it's a lyric. Now that, I don't know. That won't sit well with many people. But I think that you could say about Ephraim, certainly, which relies heavily on Dante here and there, is both a lyric and a narrative poem. And Merrill, as so often, tried to combine things. Duplicity is a kind of basic premise for Merrill. Nature, he thought, was dual. One nature, dual to the end, he says later in Sandover. He believed in, as he said at some length in an interview with the poet and his friend, J.D. McClatchy, that the world needs to be seen two ways, always, as both awful and cheerful. He was fond of Elizabeth Bishop's line at the end of the bite. And black and white, both somehow lyric and dramatic, fiction and fact at once. W.H. Auden says someplace in Sandover, when Merrill quotes him, that fact is fiction, my dears. Merrill, I think, believed that. Now, I could, if we look back just very briefly at the beginning of Ephraim, I think you can see the lyric showing through what is at the beginning of the narrative. Admittedly, I err. Do you say err or Americans say a lot, but I think you guys say err, don't you?
I think
We do,
Anyway.
we do say rather than air.
You say All right, well, good. So do I. Admittedly, I err by undertaking this in its present form. He begins a couple of motifs there that you won't notice until you've read the book a couple of times. He changed from fail. Admittedly, I fail, he once said, but he changed it. And the figure of the knight errant is prominent later in the poem. It comes up particularly as Saint Theodore. That idea is present right from the beginning, as is the relationship with the dead. I err by undertaking, he says, and the undertaking here is, of course, care for the dead, as well as the beginning of an enterprise. this in its present form. The boldest prose reportage was called for, but right away we have something other than bold prose reportage because of the way undertaking interacts with the general theme of addressing the dead by means of the Ouija board later on. Time, it had transpired, he says, was of the essence. Time, the very attar of the rose. The interplay between attar and essence and the introduction of a major figure who later has a human form here, time, is very important. He's at odds, he says, with the deadline. And of course, he's punning on deadline. As the deadline, which would be your enemy as long as you're a poet. You could maybe get by with it in the boldest prose, but not in poetry. So this undercurrent of the lyric is heard throughout here. So I just wanted to say that it is both a lyric and a narrative poem, I think. And I could go on
carry
and
on
on
at that.
about the structure of the poem, but I won't.
Let's go back to the book that
I'm
goes
sorry,
more
go
about
ahead.
the longer structure of the poem in a minute. Let's go to you, Phil, and say a bit,
Yeah.
introduce your friendship with Anthony Hecht and how you got to know him, and then
Sure.
again, perhaps a bit. We might carry on with this lyric narrative question because I think that's again a question in this wonderful Hecht poem.
Right. Well, I first got to know Hecht in 1998. Together with Ian Hamilton and Peter Dale, I'd launched a small publishing company, Between the Lines, which was devoted to publishing book-length interviews with senior contemporary poets. And Hecht's name was high up on the list of poets we wished to feature. So I wrote to him in, I think it was early '98, asking whether he'd agree, and he very graciously said he would. And this led to extended correspondence with something like 50 letters and faxes going backwards and forwards since the whole thing was being done remotely. Both because that was more economical than having me fly to the States, and because I think both of us felt that it would be easier for him to answer at least some of the questions I was putting if he had time to reflect on them and weren't being called upon to answer spontaneously. That book came out in 1999, and it was a success. It was well reviewed. It sold out very quickly, so that we had to publish a new edition. But even by the time the book was published, we'd never met. We'd never even spoken over the phone. So we were epistolary friends rather than anything else. But it turned out that Hecht and his wife were coming to Europe later that year. And my then partner and I arranged to meet them in the hill town of Asolo to the north of Venice, which is where they'd been staying. And what had been an epistolary friendship turned into a genuine friendship, a face-to-face friendship. We got along just as well in each other's company as we had on the page. To cut a long story short, not long after the success of that volume, I went alone and established a small press, the Waywiser Press, which was devoted to literary works rather than to works about literature. And that press, the Waywiser Press, had Hecht's support and his enthusiastic commitment. He wrote the foreword to one of the two books we published at the outset. And then, rather to my surprise, his UK publisher, OUP, having closed its poetry list at the behest of their accountancy department, Hecht offered Waywiser his next collection, The Darkness and the Light. And I was only too grateful to say yes. And we did well enough with that book for him to offer us the last of his the last of his poetry collections to be published, which was the collected later poems. That came 2 years later. During the interim, I met Hecht and his wife on, I think, probably half a dozen occasions, once more in Venice, and on the other occasions in the States, sometimes staying with them at their home in DC. And it was a friendship I greatly valued. I came to love the man as much as I had his work, which is saying a very great deal. So his death in 2004, at the age of 81, was a heavy blow. Now, you wanted me to say something about the Venetian Vespers, and I'll keep this as brief as I can, just to give you an overview. The poem was written in the summer of 1977, shortly after Hecht and his wife had actually been on holiday in Venice. It's almost 900 lines long, which makes it the longest of his poems by quite a stretch. And it's very carefully organized at the gross level. One can see this in the 6-part structure of the poem. The first 2 and the last 2 sections of the poem are both subdivided into 2 verse paragraphs, and the central 2 sections, the 3rd and the 4th, are subdivided into 3 verse paragraphs. I've suspected that there may be some architectural model for this, but I've never been able to establish what it is, so this is just guesswork. The poem's written in blank verse, that's to say unrhymed iambic pentameter, and it's a dramatic monologue. There's one speaker in the poem, and he's addressing us, his audience, the readership. More than that, I probably don't need to say at this point.
That's a great.
We'll be discussing it in greater detail as we progress.
Yeah, that's a great start. Before we go on to hear a bit more of the poem, because there's such a lot to talk about, but I don't know. Was there much connection between the 2 poets, between Merrill and Hecht? I know that Merrill stayed at Hecht's place, didn't he, at some point? But I don't know. I've read your wonderful edited letters of James Merrill, Stephen, which they were like calorie-free chocolates. I was on a long retreat, and I had to ration how many of the letters I would read. But I don't remember him mentioning Hecht in the letters. I'd be interested to hear if there's any connection between the 2 of them.
There were. Well, they had the greatest respect, I think, for each other. I know James did for Tony. Tony, but I don't think they spent very much time together, and there isn't much of a correspondence. There is one letter, brief letter James wrote to him about Lost in Translation. Tony had said how much he liked the poem, and James wrote back to say that he owed a line here and there to Tony. Tony, after James died, Tony wrote an elegy, a little elegy for James called, I think, James Merrill, An Adieu,
Yes.
as I recall, in the book Among the Tombs, Flight Among the Tombs.
Yes.
It's a very sweet poem, and he treats James there as a comic poet, which I think is right. I mean, he compares him to Prospero, and he ends the poem with a little recollection of James's smile, and I think that this is right. James is a comic poet rather than a tragic one, I think he would say. I sometimes think of Hecht as a tragic poet. And I think there is certainly that contrast, superficially at least, between the 2. But they have so much in common. These if you dig a little bit, these 2 long poems have a lot in common. I mean, Venice is a crucial setting. Obviously, it's the setting for Tony. And it's very important at the climax, towards the end of Ephraim, in James's poem. There's a big thunderstorm in James's poem in Venice. There's a big thunderstorm. Very interesting. I think Phil reads from it. I'm not sure. In the Vespers, the time is, from my point of view at least, a major figure, a major theme in Tony's poem. But that's something we can get into or not later, perhaps. But it is maybe the theme in Merrill's poem. They were both fastidious and grandiloquent, sometimes poets, always eloquent, grandiloquent, and they wanted to make fun of themselves. They both had great senses of humor, so there's a lot to talk about between them.
Have you got anything
I might add, in fact, there are other exchanges between the two, written exchanges, which it might be worth quoting. Tony, I'll call him Tony now, since you've started doing so, Stephen. Tony actually wrote to James Merrill in 1976 after the appearance of Divine Comedies, in which, of course, the Book of Ephraim first appeared. And this is what he wrote, if I may quote it. I've been reading Divine Comedies, and while I'm no longer absolutely speechless, it has taken me several days to find my voice among the keys I write with. Your book arrived when I was in the midst of time off from teaching and set aside to do my own work, but reading it, I confess, has stopped me dead in my tracks. I expect gradually to recover my self-esteem and to go on, but for the moment I am dazzled and choose to do nothing but admire, which I'm sure he read with great pleasure. But if I may, just in order to demonstrate that the respect and the admiration were reciprocal, I'd like to quote from a not dissimilar letter that Merrill wrote to Hecht, this time in praise of Millions of Strange Shadows, Hecht's third collection. And I quote, "Between cooking my goose and packing my bags for a month in Athens, I've not had as much time with your new book as I should need before saying much else than it is a marvel. Entirely yours. No trace of pains taken, yet everywhere the print of experience and thought. Is it presumption to say, who else is there to say it to, that different as we are, surely in this respect, I feel in complete technical sympathy with you, and am not at all sure that this isn't by far the deepest sympathy to feel in our trade, not unlike compatibility in the erotic sphere. This beautiful, purified skill of yours comes to underline what the poems have to say far more than meets the eye in those few hours." There is, I'll not read it now, but there was a subsequent letter from Merrill to Hecht congratulating him on the Venetian Vespers, a collection he very obviously held in the highest esteem. So, yeah, Stephen, you're right. They may not have been close friends, they may not have met that often, but they held each other in the highest respect.
Absolutely. They were, I think, both devoted to technique, to skill, to craft. And James, in one of the passages that I'll probably read, says that without the craft, he is at a loss to shape the tone and the subject of a poem. And I think this is a way of thinking about it that you don't see so much these days, I think. We're in a strange period in at least American poetry. But Hecht and Merrill both believed deeply in craft, and the vehicle it was for the other things, the so-called subject, and the tone, which is of great importance to both of them.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I was feeling about bringing the two of them like this together. It is that in different ways they use craft, technique, to shape a voice which is completely distinctive to each of them, but which has this sort of rigorous technical understanding. But let's hear some more of the poem, because otherwise, before we know it, we won't hear enough of their voices. So, what have I got next? So So let's hear from C. I mean, it's not quite the right way of putting it because it's always a capitalized letter of the first
No, that's
word
right.
of each poem. But let's hear some of section C from the Book of Ephraim.
Yes, this is the letters. As I say, it's an abecedarian, the Book of Ephraim. But the letters that begin the section often are little mnemonic keys to other subjects in the poem too, so that C could stand for Capri here. Maybe even for Christ, who comes up in this section, and this happens frequently in the poem. So sometimes you can locate a subject a passage you're looking for by means of thinking of the letter of other important things in that poem. So this is a recounting of the first night, uh, which he has. There were many first nights collapsed into this night, but this is a recounting of the first fictional recounting of the first contact with Ephraim, and it's about as straightforward as anything in the Book of Ephraim. It and yet it's hard to read because there are two voices. There's the voice of the poet, and then there's the voice of Ephraim. And Merrill's voice is a kind of tenor, I think, and Ephraim's I think of as a kind of baritone. And I'm going to have to shift my voice as I can a little bit. Ephraim interrupts at odd places, and it's so you. This is going to be a kind of a rough ride, though I think for me, but the import is clear. I think. What else do I want to say? I don't say anything else. This is it. Correct but cautious that first night, we asked our visitor's name, era, habitat. Ephraim, came the answer, a Greek Jew born AD 8 Xanthos. Where was that? In Greece, when wolves and ravens were in Rome. Next day, the classical dictionary yielded a Xanthos on the Asia Minor coast. Now, who are you? We told him. Are you Christians? We guessed so. What a cozy catacomb. Christ had wrought havoc in his family. Enticed my father from my mother's bed. I too had issued from a broken home, the first of several facts to coincide. Later, a favorite of Tiberius. Died AD 36 on Capri, throttled by the imperial guard for having loved the monster's nephew, Caligula. Rapidly he went on, changing the subject. A long, incriminating manuscript, boxed in bronze, lay under porphyry beneath the deepest excavations. He would help us find it, but we must please make haste because Tiberius wanted it destroyed. Oh, and where, we wondered of the void, was Tiberius these days? Stage 3. Why was he telling us? He overheard us talking to Simpson. Simpson? His link with Earth, his representative. A feeble nature, all but bestial, given to violent, short lives, one ending lately among flames in an army warehouse, slated for rebirth, but not in time, said Ephraim, to prevent the brat from wasting, just now at our cup, precious long-distance minutes. Don't hang up. So much facetiousness. Well, we were young, and these were matters of life and death, dismayed us. Was he a devil? His reply, my poor innocence, left the issue hanging fire. As it flowed on, his stream of consciousness deepened. There was a buried room, a bed wrought in silver. I can lead you there if you give me what? Ha ha! Your souls. Another time he'll say that he misread our innocence for insolence that night and meant to scare us. Our eyes met. What if? The blood's least vessel hoisted jet black sails. 5 whole minutes we were frightened stiff. But after all, we weren't that innocent. The Rover boys at 30, still red-blooded enough not to pass up an armchair revel, and pure enough at heart to beat the devil, entered into the spirit, so to speak, and said they'd leave for Capri that same week.
That's great. That's great. Incredible. That entered into the spirit, so to speak. There's just so much wit in that section, so much of Merrill's wit. Perhaps the obvious thing to say is a little bit about the Ouija board and what does that mean, and what does that mean for you? And Merrill himself is very, very interesting when he talks about that in interviews. But I'll leave you to talk about that, and then we'll go over to you, Phil, and talk more and see that contrast with Hecht's different voice.
Sure. Well, it's hard to remember right now, but because the poem has been read so much by so many people over here, I understand that it is not read so much in the UK. But it was a real surprise when people knew that James was writing this poem. Some of his friends advised him strongly against it. It was too silly, too campy, and his very reputation might be at stake if he pursued. But this was an undertaking, the conversations with the board that he and David had been doing daily when they were together for years and years. They did it always. It was a routine with them. He was committed to it, and he was sure there was a subject here. And it's not as though he didn't have precedent. I mean, there are even Milton, said that he took dictation. And Blake, of course. Hugo did his table tapping. Cadman, the old English poet, had a vision and heard a voice. It goes way back, the idea of Yeats, an example that Merrill cites frequently, had a vision and all those voices that came through his wife. So it's not as though there wasn't precedent. And I think that people have come to accept it as zany, eccentric, but interesting. So this is a problem that was a part of the past, I think, pretty quickly, and partly because James himself was always suspicious about it. And much of Mirabelle, which is the second part of the trilogy, The Changing Light at Sandover, is given over to a questioning of Ephraim and his superiors, like Mirabelle, the others higher in the hierarchy in the other world. James could never make up his mind. I saw him when he would take it all with a grain of salt, or more than a grain of salt. I also saw him, though, when he was really taken aback by his own communications. He didn't know sometimes what to make of the communication. And Ephraim, and especially Mirabelle, and then others even higher in the hierarchy of Mirabelle, were so fluent sometimes over the board that it was hard to believe. I saw the board work, and it went like lightning. It went so quickly that James, who took the dictation, David, the power came through David. David's right hand was on the cup. He kept his left hand free to smoke. And James had his left hand on the cup, and his right hand was free to take dictate. And James's hand moved so quickly that he couldn't divide the words, and often he was just transcribing the sounds, and he had to go back later and figure out what the word was. So it was really quite something to watch. But he always felt two ways about it. And the three main parts of the scripts for the pageant are called, in fact, yes and no. Again, it's a testimony to James's conviction that the world is opposed to itself, that it is its contraries. He believed it and he didn't believe it.
I want to come back in a bit to I want to come back a bit to the sort of world that he creates. You know, I in a minute, but I want to keep moving between Merrill and Merrill and
Harold and Hecht, love it.
Harold and Hecht, Ray Merrill kind of thing. So we keep hearing the different voices, but and we'll say more about the faith in each poem. But let's come first of all to you, Phil, and let's hear a little bit from section 3 from the Venetian Vespers.
Sure.
Again, set in Venice, and this incredible. I mean, many of the parts that struck me is Hecht's remarkable power of just observation and how vividly he creates a world. I just thought we'd hear that, and then, but you'll hear again the difference of tone. Couldn't be more. I thought, you know. So let's hear
Absolutely.
about that.
Maybe I can preface this reading with a little bit of background so that people know exactly what's going on. The speaker of the poem, as we learn in the earlier sections, is an expatriated American, probably in his mid-50s, living now in Venice. He rents a room in a seedy albergo somewhere close to the Basilica of San Marco. He's clearly a troubled man, and we learn early on in the poem that he has something of some importance to tell us about. But we learn also pretty quickly that he's in no rush to tell us what that is. That line, the last of the lines I read before, where to begin, is repeated 500 lines later, by which time we're 3/4 of the way through the poem. And its repeat there strongly suggests that what we've been reading in the interim is prelude, but we may also suspect that it's the result of prevarication. He can't bring himself to tell us exactly what it is that's troubling him. Now, along the way in these first three sections, there have been a number of digressions, and we're about to encounter another. It's a digression which, like the others, I would argue, is revealing of this troubled man's state of mind, but only when seen properly in its context. So here he is, about to enter the Basilica of San Marco. I enter the obscure aquarium dimness, the movie palace dark, through which incline smoky diagonals and radiant bars of sunlight from the high southeastern crescents of windowed drums above, like slow blind fingers finding their patient and unvarying way across the braille of pavement, edging along the Pavonine and lapidary walls, inching through silence as the earth revolves to huge compulsions, as the turning spheres drift in their milky, pale, galactic light through endless, quiet, gigantic vacancy, unpitying, inhuman, terrible. In time, the eye accommodates itself to the dull phosphorescence. Gradually, glories reveal themselves. Grave mysteries of the faith cast off their shadows, assume their forms against a heaven of coined and sequined light, a splatter of gilt cobblestones, flung grains of crumbs of brilliance, the vast open fields of the sky turned intimate and friendly, patins and laminae, a vermeil shimmering of fish-scaled, cataphracted golden plates. Here the saints and angels brought together in studied reveries of happiness. Enormous wings of seraphim uphold the crowning domes where the convened apostles receive their fiery tongues from the Godhead descended to them as a floating dove, patriarch and collateral ancestor of the pigeons out in the square. Into these choirs of lacquered thrones, enamelled archangels and medalled principalities rise up a cool plantation of columns, marble shafts bearing their lifted pathways, viaducts and catwalks through the middle realms of heaven. Even as God descended into the mass and thick of us, so is he borne aloft as promise and precursor to us all, ascending in the central dome's vast hive of honeyed luminosity. Behind the altar he appears, 2 fingers raised in benediction, in what seems 2/3 of the Boy Scout salute, wishing us well. And we are gathered here below the saints, virtues and martyrs, sheltered in their glow, soothed by the punk and incense, to rejoice in the warm light of Gabriele's horns, and for a moment of unwonted grace, we are so blessed as to forget ourselves. I think it's a pretty remarkable bit of writing, and if San Marco has been better described, I'm not sure where. Even Ruskin might have looked on somewhat enviously at this passage.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's wonderfully. The what strikes me next to that gorgeous writing is the way it ends there. We are so blessed as to forget ourselves. This
Yes.
is a situation, a condition that he finds himself in a few times.
Several, yes.
It's as though this were the point somehow of the writing, of the seeing. This is an escape.
Indeed.
I think.
It's a theme, as you say, Stephen, that recurs throughout the poem. In fact, it's there in the opening lines.
Yes.
If we go back to those briefly.
Yes, exactly.
Only to be repeated at several intervals. What's merciful is not knowing where you are, what time it is,
Yeah.
even your name of age. Just merely a clean coolness at the temple. It's an escape from self and from all the things that are besetting him. What he later on calls the now I remember the phrase, the wormings of his brain.
Yes.
And this is only to be had by rapt concentration, typically concentration on something he can see,
Yes, he has
such
that
as
wonderful.
the interior of the basilica, or an oncoming storm, or a gathering of clouds.
I sometimes, I'm looking for that passage, and maybe I won't be able to find it, where he talks about attention. Oh yes, this is at the very end of section 4. I have a page number, but you guys will have different books. He's been describing the rainstorm, I think, and he says to give one's whole attention to such a sight is a sort of blessedness. No room is left for antecedents, inference, nuance. One escapes from all the anguish of this world into the refuge of the present tense. The past is mercifully dissolved. Sometimes it seems as though if you were to take this Phil with his attention to vocabulary, that's one of his things he's proudest of, I think, is his vocabulary.
Indeed.
And how he says things and how he sees things, these are his ways of putting off the terrible world somehow, getting out of it. It's as though he were speaking in a perverse way for the poet. For any poet, I mean, for any artist, for anyone who sees and has to say, if he's a poet, what he sees. And it's remarkable. The pity I feel for him is one with my admiration of him.
It's very striking to me listening to those two excerpts. You've got James Merrill's wonderful comedy, which is very, very warm, as well as being very funny, as well as being very, very clever. You know, very, very clever. There's not many people who can get away with being clever. You know, cleverness, in my mind, is often pejorative. You know, so I don't know very many poets who can get away with that without looking like they're showing off, basically. But Merrill has this wonderful warmth and wit with it, which is beautiful. And then to go over to Hecht, that beginning of this awful image of the world turning, and this sort of nihilistic nightmare it starts with, and then that description taking us all the way, this incredible, you know, it's a description of the interior of St. Marco, but it's also this incredible, you know, experience of heaven and meeting God, albeit blessing us like a Boy Scout's salute, which is actually strangely like Merrill. You know, there's a sudden sort of bathos and wit. So I wanted to talk about that first, and then I want to say a little bit about the faith in both of them. But can you say something about, you know, Merrill's comedy and Hecht's, this awful sense that not all of the poems of Hecht, but so often you feel that something is rotten in the state of Denmark, or in this case in the state of Venice, perhaps in the state of America, perhaps even more deeply in the state of the world. His diction is gorgeous. Like Merrill's, he's got this incredible sophisticated diction, a very, at times, quite highfalutin, romantic some poems. Like some of the poems start off like Wordsworthian romantic lyrics. I'm thinking of the Book of Ephraim, for instance, which starts off with this wandering poet and ends in the most horrific tragedy. I wonder, perhaps you might start by saying something about that tragic sense that you get in that poem there, and then this incredible flight into heaven and God and into the absolution of the moment.
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that there's a fairly interesting shift in the register there. I mean, we do go from what you're calling this highfalutin vocabulary and the gorgeous description of the interior of the church through to that picture of God as a Boy Scout master, and there's no doubting that has a deflationary effect, if I can put it like that. I think what interests me about this passage is what it reveals about this troubled man, because by his own admission, he's not merely troubled, he is something of a lonely misanthrope. There's only one person mentioned in the whole of the poem that we might regard as having been a friend of his, certainly a comrade in arms. We'll come to this in my next reading. And here he is in the church looking up at all these figures and taking... one imagines, because he tells us that even though he's an unbeliever, an infidel he calls himself, that he visits the basilica twice weekly as a matter of routine, and one is given to understand that these figures, the figure of God himself, but all the the angels and others, are, as it were, friends of his, people or beings that he looks up to and takes some pleasure in the contemplation of. So even though this is another of the passages in which one might think Hecht is digressing from the narrative line, it is powerfully revealing of his state of mind. He wouldn't need to tell us, as he does, that he's a lonely and misanthropic character. These things would come to light as revealed in passages of this kind.
Yeah, his master here sometimes seems to be Browning, and this is something you don't almost never get in Merrill. The extended monologue and the deep development psychologically of a character that is utterly foreign to the poet. Of course, not utterly foreign, you would say, and you would be right. And Merrill would insist on that, but seemingly foreign, and that's Browning, and you just don't hear much Browning in Merrill. So
it's interesting you mentioned that, Stephen, because it was Browning that I was wondering about, and there's something there's something of that Browning's kind of breakdown into these horrors at times, murder, exquisite writing that does seem to be passed on very much to Hecht. We'll touch more.
Well, I might
go on.
Yeah, I was just going to interject at that point. I said earlier on that when I first met Hecht, it was in Asolo, which was for a time where Browning himself lived, and that fact may well have registered with Hecht. This wasn't the first time he'd been to Asolo. He'd been there many times before. He may even, I don't know for sure, but he may even have been there in 1977, which is when he began work on the poem. So Browning is almost certainly a figure in the back of his mind.
But Stephen, you say that Browning's a long way away from Merrill, isn't he? He's there's none of that in Merrill. Merrill is always playing on himself, on the persona of the poet. But it's that reading that you've just done, it just shows you this wonderful comedy that you get. And the criticism I get of people when they read Merrill is that this is virtuosic writing, but is it really a bit frivolous? I think it rises into beauties, but it might be good to see how Merrill takes the comic form and takes it up. It's almost as if Hecht takes a romantic form and takes it down into tragedy. It's perhaps saying a bit more about Merrill's comic voice.
Well, the next two passages that I get to read will take us in those two directions, I think. I don't mean to push us on there, but one thing about Merrill is, he doesn't do many dramatic monologues. There are very few. What he has instead is a host of characters. He's a very social poet. There's a passage in Stevens that I was looking up a minute ago. This is from one of Stevens's letters. And it doesn't sound all that much like Stevens, really. Well, it does in a way. He says, where'd it go? He's talking about Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction, which is one of the poems that Merrill referred to time and again. It was his favorite, I think, of Stevens's poems, and one of the long poems that had a terrific impact on Merrill. Stephen says, there is a perfect rout of characters in every man, and every man is like an actor's trunk, full of strange creatures, old and new. Now, it makes a certain sense when you're reading Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction and you see all these weird characters, from the ephebe to the plantation owner and so on. But it makes perfect sense too in regard to Ephraim, which is full of characters, a perfect route of characters. And so that's again to come to the difference between them, I think. There's a lot of the drawing room comedy about Merrill. And people play bridge in Merrill as well as have the Ouija board is very much a social, domestic kind of thing. And Hecht is more interested often in the mind has mountains, pits of fall and so on. It's that kind of thing. So there is a dramatic difference between them, even though they are often linked uh, because of the formalism, because of their traditionalism. They're looking back, Hecht looking back to things from Scripture through Browning, and Merrill always looking back. They both look back to Dante. This is and it's characteristic. They are among the last, most recently, of poets who have that strong, deep rooting in tradition. Things have changed for the moment,
Yeah, they have.
and influences are contemporary
I want to come
in the United
at the
States.
end of our conversation. I want to get you to sort of say something more about where we are in this kind of contemporary world of poetry, which I find myself going back to writers like Hecht and Merrill again and again, because they seem to me to have so much, I want to learn from them, really, in my own, sorry, attempts at writing. I want to learn from them. Let's hear a bit more, though, because I want to, let's go to that section from the end of section 3 and of Anthony Hecht, which this was a section for me that really, I remember playing, my poor mother recently died, and I remembered I was playing it, listening to it, and my mother came and joined me, and she was, she grew up in the war, and my father fought in the war, and I remember her, my mother couldn't be less poetic, but I remember her being very struck by this passage, and it makes, for me, an indelible impression. But let you read it, and then we'll see what we think of this section.
Can I again preface it with a little bit of background? Sure. Well, what we've learnt when we get as far as this is that the speaker has had a very troubled childhood, a childhood in which, to begin with, his father disappears. On the face of it, he's gone off to earn his fortune, headed west, but having promised that he would call for his wife and son to follow as soon as he'd succeeded, they never hear from him again. A few years later, the boy who is living with his uncle loses his mother, this time to death. So there's, on the face of it, a fairly troubled background here. But the real trouble doesn't start until the speaker's father, some 12 years after the mother's death, reappears, but as a corpse, sent back in a boxcar. And at this point, we are given by the speaker an explanation of what had happened to the father. But it's one of the mysteries at the heart of this poem how that explanation came to him. We don't know when he got it, we don't know who gave it to him. And while it's perhaps not too difficult to fill this out in intelligible ways, it does remain a bit of a puzzle at the centre of the poem. Anyway, we are told that the day after his father's funeral, he enlists in the army and is sent off to war. And the section of the poem you've asked me to read gives us an account of his experiences. If I can just find it.
This is at the end of 3.
Yeah, I've got it. Thanks.
No, yeah, I was looking for it myself. I wasn't directing
Sorry,
you. Sorry.
you found it.
Thinking aloud.
Okay. It wasn't always so. I was an aid man, a medic with an infantry company, who, because of my refusal to bear arms, was constrained to bear the wounded and the dead from under enemy fire, and to witness to inconceivable pain, usually shot at though banded with red crosses and unarmed. There was a corporal I knew in heavy weapons, someone who carried with him into combat a book of etiquette by Emily Post. Most brought with them some token of the past, some emblem of attachment or affection or coddled childhood, Bibles and baby booties, harmonicas, love letters, photographs. But this was different. I discovered later that he had been brought up in an orphanage, so the book was his fiction of kindliness, a novel in which personages of wealth firmly secured domestic tranquility. He'd cite me instances. It seems a boy will not put Mr. on his calling cards till he leaves school, and may omit the Mr. even while at college. Bread and butter plates are never placed on a formal dinner table. At a simple dinner party, one may serve claret instead of champagne with the meat. The satin facings on a butler's lapels are narrower than a gentleman's, and he wears black waistcoat with white tie, whereas the gentleman's white waistcoat goes with both black tie and white. When a lady lunches alone at her own home, in a formally kept house, the table is set for 4, as if 3 Elijahs were expected. This was to him a sort of corpus juris, an ancient piety and governance, worthy of constant dream and meditation. He haunts me here, that seeker after law in a lawless world, in rain-soaked combat boots, oil-stained fatigues and heavy bandoliers. He was killed by enemy machine-gun fire. His helmet had fallen off. They had sheared away the top of his cranium like a soft-boiled egg, and there he crouched, huddled over his weapon, his brains wet in the chalice of his skull. I mean, the contrast here, the plainness of the diction, the flatness of the delivery, yet again remarkable to me. And I well understand your mother's reaction and yours, Maitreyabandhu, to this. I defy anybody to read it and not find it shocking at the end. It's, I mean, one or two things arising out of this that I might briefly add. One is that Hecht, of course, served in the army. He was an infantryman and saw terrible things during his time in the war. But one thing that only came to light relatively recently was that although Hecht was an infantryman and carried a gun, he never used it during the war and felt very guilty about this afterwards. He could never bring himself to actually shoot at anybody, even though the opportunities did present themselves. And this maybe has a bearing on the speakers having been a medic and not carrying a gun. But having said that, I would add very quickly that Hecht was always at pains to deny any idea that the speaker was an avatar for him. He admitted that a part of him was present in the character. A bit more was supplied by his younger brother, Roger. But mostly it was a man he'd got to know on Ischia in the early 1950s, a deeply troubled but apparently very kind and generous fellow whose story is pretty much the story of the speaker from start to finish.
Oh, crikey. I mean, I think this section is a piece of genius. Sometimes you do need that word, don't you? I don't want that word outlawed, because you need a word to describe something that you just, even when you worked really hard, you couldn't do, and most people can't do. that description of the English country house is exquisitely sort of trivial in a sense.
Yeah.
And then to get from there to the chalice of his skull,
Yes. Yes.
it's deeply shocking and traumatizing. And I suppose that does bring in, I suppose we might have to mention, Hecht had so much trauma in his life from the war. He wasn't he? He interviewed a lot of people who were being liberated from the concentration camps, and
he was part of the unit which liberated Flossenburg, which was a slave labor camp in Bavaria, close to the Czech border. And during our discussion, he said that by the time they got there, 500 people were dying every day just of typhus. But something in the region of 30,000 people had perished even before the liberation. As a result of overwork, malnutrition and disease. So the scene that opened up before them as they entered that camp was, by all accounts, a truly horrific one. And as I said before, this experience, allied to others he'd had previously, scarred him for life. And he admitted on his return to the States, he spent 2 weeks in an alcoholic stupor, and continued for a long time after that to wake up screaming. So those experiences marked him for life, and they're to be found not just here in this passage in the Vespers, but elsewhere in his work, of course.
Yeah, I mean, to survive that experience of him, is so. I mean, it goes beyond language, and yet he's, so in some of the most terrifying poems I think that have ever been written, he does find a way of giving them voice, and I think that's very important. But yes, it sort of poisons the undersprings of life. It feels like the waters of life. Stephen, you were going to say something then.
Oh, I was just, what you were saying about the language, that last line, chalice does such work there. I mean, that's a word chosen with the kind of care that the person who operates according to Emily Post would recognize. And so the care comes back there in the choice of the word and the idea of the soft-boiled egg. I mean, you use a special kind of scissors, do you not, to take off the top of a soft-boiled egg? They sheared away.
I don't know about the scissors. I've never used scissors, anyway. But I'm prepared to believe it.
I'm prepared to believe it as well.
But chalice is such a perfect word.
Yeah.
Well, following on from the description of the basilica,
exactly.
In which, of course, a chalice would play a vital part.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is just one of several motifs that show up throughout the poem. I spoke earlier about the six-part structure and the very careful subdivisions within those sections. What I didn't mention at the time was the presence throughout the poem of a range of motifs, from the chalice and the dome, of course, of the church, through to the presence of bubbles and streams of light, and there are sundry others, all of which are introduced in the most subtle and seamless of ways. They don't draw attention to themselves. But as one progresses through the poem, they resonate. Each time one comes at them, each time from a different angle. It's quite remarkably done.
This is what happens in Merrill too. The repetition of motifs from the weirdest angles, where what does he say at the beginning? That passage we read earlier, every least object, the steady light shines back from every least detail exposed to it. And this is true in Hecht, and it's true in Merrill too, which Ephraim is so tight in that way that there's hardly a detail that is not picked up elsewhere. The but I get ahead of myself, and so I won't. There's if I do Q next, that little section.
Yeah,
from
let's
Q
hear
I
that
wanted
section
to
from
do,
Q. I mean, when I got to Q in the book, it dropped
which
me.
might not be on our chart.
When I first read it, Stephen, when I got to Q, I bought.
Oh, we're losing you again, Maitreyabandhu.
Can we stop a minute and then restart? Let's try that. We're trying another. Yeah, is that better?
We can hear you. Yeah, you're back.
Okay, good. We've changed our something, so
Yeah, there you are.
I'm back. Where was I? I was saying something.
I had just mentioned Q.
So yeah, let's start again with Q. So I'll wave a little thing to show that we're going to cut there. But yeah, Stephen, when I got to Q in the Book of Ephraim, at first it just drove me mad. You know, all these these quotations. I bought quite a few friends your annotated Ephraim. One of them.
Oh, thank you.
One of them drove him mad.
Yeah.
And he was saying he stopped at Q. You know, when he got to Q, he was like, "That's it, I'm out of here." You know, he said, "You can't do this. You can't just stick in all these quotes that aren't even in meter anymore. That what are you doing?" So perhaps say something about Q. I stumbled over it at first. I used to skip it, I'm afraid, in my earlier readings. But your annotations have helped no end.
Oh, good. Well, that's what they were for. Well, I think Q is a kind of stroke of genius. I mean, the so-called Apillion, of which this might be an example, is characterized in part by digressions, and this is a huge digression. But what it does is take us to the works that Merrill was reading or remembering when he was writing Ephraim. So these are a bunch of touchstones, or it's as though he had a commonplace book that he were keeping and he had quoted from it here in these dozen or so quotations. Each of them picks up motifs from elsewhere in the poem and takes them from a special angle. So, for example, let me quote from Q. There are two sections like this. The book is rigorously organized. Each of the sections has a time we can put to it and a place. And so there are several ways that Ephraim is organized, but there are two parts that do not have a time or a place. One is D for the characters that appear elsewhere in the book, not personae, and the other is Q for these quotations that have some bearing on what he's doing. Here it is. It's the second one of these quotations. He's quoting from A.H. Clarendon, who does not exist. This is the one. He has quoted Clarendon before in a long poem in Nights and Days, where from a book called Psyche's Sisters. Well, Clarendon evidently also wrote a book called Time Was, which at one point James was thinking about using as a title for this book. But he chose not to when David Jackson suddenly came up with, how about Divine Comedies? And yes, perfect. That this is a made-up quotation, but it's based on a book about Brian Howard, who is somebody that he's someone that you might know better than I. He's a kind of an elite academician and writer, English. Anyway, so this is about, I think, Brian Howard. One evening, I'm quoting now from Mr. Clarendon. One evening, late in the war, he was at the crowded bar. Other bars come up, including the legal bar. He was at the crowded bar of the Smart Pyramid Club in uniform and behaving quite outrageously. Among the observers, an elderly American admiral had been growing more and more incensed. He now went over and tapped Teddy on the shoulder. "Lieutenant, you are a disgrace to the service. I must insist on having your name and squadron." An awful silence fell. Teddy's newly won wings glinted. He's an airman, you understand, and at the bar drinking and being very gay and out about it and campy. Teddy snapped shut his thin gold compact from Hermes and narrowed his eyes at the admiral. "My name," he said distinctly, "is Mrs. Smith." Well, Teddy is a version of the much more dignified Saint Theodore. Patron saint, is he not, of England?
No, that's St.
No?
George.
St. George, you're right. Of course you're right. And St. George comes up too here. But Teddy is a version of Saint Theodore, who figures in a painting that gets a wonderful ekphrastic section, very serious one in section T. His wings connect him to Hermes, who is the tutelary deity, if there is one, in Ephraim. Merrill was reading, he doesn't quote him here, but he was reading a book by John Armstrong about Hermes and his association with poets, because Hermes is a messenger, of course, of the gods, and a psychopomp, the transmitter of the souls to the other world. The boundary stones, as you know, in Greece are called herms because they mark boundaries through which Hermes flies on his way. He's a transgressor of boundaries, Hermes. And he's therefore a type of the imagination, the vehicle for the imagination. He breaks rules, he breaks laws, he stole the oxen of the gods. He's a thief, and thieves come up in Ephraim. The poem ends with a wonderful theft. And the characters in Merrill, as they do in Pound and in Eliot in The Wasteland, according to Eliot, tend to blur into each other. So there's a sense in which Teddy is Merrill, as well as Hermes, the poet in both cases. He's one of these centripetal figures that just flows out in all directions to connect with other motifs and people elsewhere. There are a couple of analogs that I'm going to quit talking here, but it's kind of the center of the poem. I'm going to wait until I get to the next one, which is a kind of the climax of the poem.
Perhaps we should pause here for a minute with that, because it would be good to talk a bit about, that section from Q is very camp, and Merrill is quite willing to be really silly, especially as the changing light of Sandover goes on. I mean, it gets nuts, doesn't it? We get UFOs, we get all sorts of, it's delightful. I wonder whether you could say something a bit about Merrill's, one of the things I admire about him, he writes very, very straightforwardly as a gay man, really. I'm reading Tom Gunn's letters at the moment, and Gunn, talks about, Mirabal as being, one of the best description of a gay marriage that's been written, which I thought was exactly right. But he won't be he's not a sort of LGBTQ poster boy either. He doesn't want to make it who he is. He just wants to say, that's what I do. And I know he struggled with that with his mother, for instance. I wonder whether you might say a little bit about, Merrill and you know, being a gay writer, you know.
Well, somebody I remember, but pretty early on, asked James when people began to be known for coming out, when he came out, and he said, "Well, he never came out of the closet." He said he just stood there and went on writing, and the closet went to pieces around him. And it's true. You look back now and you see that he was always a gay writer,
Yeah.
but he wasn't. Nothing was made of it at first, and then gradually it was known widely that he was one of the best gay writers around. But his mother, yes, uh, he was terrified of her. He loved her very deeply and was very terrified, and he wrote endless letters to her and was worried at the end of his life about letting people know that he had AIDS because he didn't want his mother to know. That was why. He didn't care about other people knowing. But he didn't want his mother to know, and somehow he thought that she wouldn't know. And so that coming out of a person with the disease, that was very hard for him.
Yeah. I mean, it's remarkable, I think, because I feel that Merrill is undervalued. I think he's undervalued in the UK. I think it's something about Merrill's comedy that people therefore won't take him seriously, or something like that. That you're not allowed in the UK to be funny and serious. You have to be one or the other. And then we know where you are. We know what to call you. But because I think he's also a great age lyricist, like Gunn, but Gunn is very out with that. Whereas actually, once you know that about Merrill, it's particularly in Prose of Departure, but also that wonderful, very late poem, Christmas Tree. They're genius kind of AIDS elegies, really, or they could be read like that.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful poem. You pick out two beautiful poems. Sandy McClatchy and I kept Prose of Departure out of the selected poems that we did at one point, and it was a mistake. I'm largely responsible for that mistake. We were thinking about length of the book and so on, and it's a very long piece, but God, it's a classic, a model of its kind for that kind of basho nature walk poem. But yeah, so those are both beautiful poems. Christmas Tree is one of my favorite poems to read. Yeah.
Absolutely wonderful poem.
Yeah, I agree.
And written when it was so late in his life.
Yes.
It's a quite extraordinary achievement.
No,
if you'd only written one poem like that in your life, you could rest content.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Indeed. Look, we better not get on to other poems, otherwise we really will be. So let's go back to you, Philip, and let's hear another section that I suggested. I've rather been cheeky enough to suggest the sections that really you want to read the whole of both poems, but then we'd be here for all day as well as all night. But let's hear that section, When I Was 6 Years Old.
Yeah, sure. I've already anticipated some of the content of this passage in the background I gave to the previous one, but no matter. When I was 6 years old, this is the speaker once again, going back to his childhood. When I was 6 years old, it rained and never seemed to stop. I had an oilskin, a bright sou'wester, stiff and sunflower yellow, and fireman boots. Rain stippled the windows of the school bus that brought us home at dusk, that was no longer dusk, but massing dark, as that small world of kids drove into winter, and always in that dark our grocery store looked like a theatre or a puppet show, lit, warm, and peopled with the family cast, full of prop vegetables, a brighter sight than anyone else's home. Therefore, I knew that something was clearly up when the bus door hinged open and all the lights were on upstairs. But only the bulb at the cash register lit the store itself, half dark and on the steps, still in his apron, standing in the rain, my uncle. He was soaked through. He told me he was taking me to a movie and then to supper at a restaurant, though the next day was school and I had homework. It was clear to me that such a treat exacted on my part the condition that I shouldn't question it. We went to see a bedroom comedy, Let Us Be Gay, scarcely for 6-year-olds, throughout the length of which my uncle wept. And then we went to a Chinese restaurant, and I sat next to the window where I could see, beyond the Chinese equivalent of Salada, encoded on the glass, the oil-slicked streets, the gutters with their little allagashers bent on some urgent mission to the sea. Next day, they told me that my mother was dead. I didn't go to school. I watched the rain from the bedroom window or from my burlap nest behind the counter. My whole life was changed without my having done a single thing. I should have prefaced this by saying that Salada, the sign he's referring to there is the name of a tea with which he was familiar from his store.
I mean, it's again an incredible passage of almost hypnotic clarity, like that bus going off into the dark. Why is it that you see that so very vividly, and that strange twilight, massing dark, the hinge of the word hinge, like spooky clarity, which I don't know how he managed, and then this integrated into that clarity is this incredible intelligence at work in Hecht. In a sense, I have nothing much to say about it, but I was just so struck by those two qualities, just you reading it again there.
I think, again, it's a remarkable passage, free of the ornamentation that you find elsewhere in the poem. And it builds to this small climax where he learns that that his whole life has been changed without him doing a single thing. His mother is dead. Again, there's something of a mystery here, a mystery which might be revealing of something about the speaker. I mean, the mystery is that we're told very early on in the poem that his mother has suffered from a long illness. Why, when he comes home from school and he realizes that something serious has happened, and is given to understand that he mustn't ask what it is, why does it not occur to him that it may have something to do with his mother? Now, I don't take this to be a fault in the narrative. My suspicion is that it's telling us something about the self-obsessed nature of this boy, and just possibly this may not be quite so clear, but just possibly his capacity at this time in his life for denial, for turning his back on things. At any rate, it seems to me to raise the question. How is it that it hasn't occurred to him that this might somehow involve his mother?
There are mysteries about this poem, which I don't mind. What Pound says someplace, leave blanks for what you don't know.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But a lot of the mysteries seem to me to have to do with the uncle. Towards the end of the poem, just as my uncle, this is in section 6, who my blood tells me on its nightly rounds may perhaps be a little more than kin, has paid the price for his unlawful grief and bloodless butchery by creating me his guilty legatee. Now this is his father's brother, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on in that passage. I don't know what his uncle has to do with his mother.
Well, perhaps I can throw some light on it. I mean, his uncle has brought the newly married couple, who are the speaker's parents, across from the old country. We're not told early on which country that is. And they, together with the father's other brothers, who've also been brought over, are working in this store in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and which also, incidentally, happens to be the town in which the young Robert Frost was raised. After his father had died, and the family had to move from the west coast to the east. What happens is that the father disappears, and then eventually, as we've already seen, shows up as a corpse.
Right.
But in the meantime, the speaker, as a young man, has witnessed the grief with which the mother's death has been greeted. He's also learnt that, this later on, that when his father's corpse is returned, this is after the father... I'm sorry, I'm garbling this. You may need to...
You're perfectly clear, Phil.
But basically, the explanation the speaker is given, again, we don't know by whom or quite when, the speaker learns that his father had actually been mugged in Toledo, Ohio. He'd gone a relatively small distance, certainly hadn't got as far as he'd intended to. He'd been mugged, robbed, and left unconscious. And when he'd come to in the local hospital, he couldn't make himself understood,
Right.
Because he only had a few words of English, was probably concussed still, and there was no identification on him, his wallet having been stolen. So the local authorities sent him off to the nearby asylum, and he remained there for a full year before somebody visiting the hospital, who overheard him speaking and recognized the language.
Right.
At that point, it was understood that he wasn't mad, he wasn't unhinged, and an effort was made to send him home. The authorities writing back to the uncle, not just once but 3 times, saying, if you remit the money we need in order to put him on a train, we'll send him home. But the uncle never responded.
That's right.
Now, this strongly suggests, I mean, we are reading between the lines here, but this is what the speaker himself was doing. This strongly suggests that the uncle didn't want his brother back.
Right.
And why would that be?
Yes.
It may be because of the amount of economic pressure they were already under, but just as likely, it seems, is the possibility that he and the brother's wife were having an affair.
Well, exactly.
We can't be sure that our narrator, the speaker, is actually giving us the full picture. It's conceivable that the father left home not in order to make his fortune, but to escape what was going on between the uncle and his wife. We're speculating here.
Well, that was a feeling that I had, but I couldn't have said it myself. But I'm glad you did, and
Sure.
that fleshes that out beautifully.
But there's also something really important about that final passage, which I'm not sure has actually been discussed. Certainly, I haven't come across any discussions of it. But if we can just go to the lines you quoted. Just as my uncle, who my blood tells me on its nightly rounds, may perhaps be a little more than kin, the quotation from Hamlet, of course, has paid the price for his unlawful grief and bloodless butchery by creating me, line break, his guilty legatee. There could even here, in that line break, be the suggestion that he isn't his father's son, he's his uncle's son. Right. And the fact that he was 1 year old when the father actually left home might be thought to lend some substance to that suspicion.
Well,
So,
you have
yeah,
you have
sorry,
no. I'm sorry. I'm interrupting you.
go
All
ahead.
right. Well, I'll interrupt you. I'm interrupting you, Phil, because you have just you've just maybe cleared up something else for me. The last line of the poem, he who was never even at one time a wise child.
Uh,
Now that has proverbial sources, but it reminds one perhaps of a line in Merchant of Venice, where it is said that it is a wise man who knows his own child.
Yes, indeed.
And I wonder whether, and that has always seemed to me a kind of weird way to end the poem,
yes.
but it would follow on
Yeah,
what we're saying here. He is a wise man who knows his own child who was never once a wise child. Yes, I
yeah.
I think so. Yeah, fascinating.
Well, I mean, I don't know if this is the right moment to follow it up, but that quotation from Hamlet,
Yes.
followed up by the uh, it, the last line, which is a quotation itself. Um, Throughout the poem, I mean, Stephen, you spoke earlier about the Book of Ephraim being an epillion, and it struck me after I'd come across and looked up that term that it could almost as easily be applied to Venetian Vespers,
Uh-huh.
which itself is a much shorter epic than the Book of Ephraim, of course, but a short epic of sorts. And the things which characterize an epillion, from lavish and vivid description through to digression, through to learned allusion, all of these
Right.
things apply just as forcibly to
I agree.
Venetian Vespers as it does to the Book of Ephraim. Throughout the poem, and seamlessly interwoven in the text, are numerous quotations and allusions. Some of them straight, others slightly distorted. But you could read these without knowing that that's what they were.
Oh yeah.
They're so beautifully dovetailed with the
Yeah.
rest of the text. If you do recognize them, however, as you did at the end of this poem, it adds to the resonance and maybe casts a new light on what you're reading,
Yeah.
tempting you to read them in a slightly different way than you would if you hadn't. So it is littered with such allusions,
Yes.
all of them brilliantly used and never used in ways that are merely clever or self-advertising.
That's yes. Well, this brings us too quickly to the end, where Maitreyabandhu suggests that we might want to talk about the state of contemporary poetry. But I mean, this is the kind of thing that Merrill and Hecht, they grew up with. I was reading about John Berryman again the other day. Berryman thought of himself as at least half a scholar, and he wrote a big book on King Lear. He spent as much of his life writing on King Lear. That doesn't happen so much these days. But anyway, yes, isn't that a wonderful term, a pillion? I think it was invented in the 19th century when people began to look back and see, well, like Ovid, which is what somebody said is a kind of series of apilia, and other of those Greek and Roman poems that were not quite epic, and that Shakespeare picked up, and Marlowe, The Rape of Lucrece, and Hero and Leander, and so on. And I think it was quite a genre in the Renaissance, and people forgot about it.
Yeah, I had to look
But
that up as well.
pardon me.
I had to look up a pillion as well. We better come. We better start
Yeah,
for an end. I want to get the two of you to read two more sections. I'd love to read, as I say, the whole poem. But before we get to that, one of the things, again, I feel about the Venetian Vespers is it strikes me as a great American poem, particularly, and a great poem about immigration. The agony. I mean, it's deeply moving and tragic on different levels. There's, you know, I think Hecht is a great war poet, but then you get this, you know, remarkably visceral account of the horrors really of immigration. You know, we've sort of forgotten that world, a world where you leave one country without a language to another country that's utterly foreign, where you have to fit in, where with all the pressures. And I think this poem is a masterpiece about that. You know, so much of the world, and still now, is these terrible immigrations, and the almost the pressure that puts on the individuals in the midst of that. And what you see in the Venetian Vespers is the effects of immigration that's still happening now. I don't know whether that's what you feel, but one of the things that I found very moving about it is it's a great immigration poem, and that's been such a great story of human beings from the beginning of time and still now.
And of course, Hecht's antecedents were immigrants,
Right,
German Jewish. I think you had to go 2 generations back. His parents had been born in America, and his grandparents had too. But before then, they were immigrants from Germany. So yes, I think this is probably there in the background, and
when the speakers
and of course it has a bearing on the story we've been hearing, because there is a suggestion that the reason why the uncle didn't ask for his brother to be brought back was because of the potential shame. Having somebody who'd been in a mental hospital for a year would have brought down on the family's shoulders, with who knows what consequences for the AMP store they were running.
You know, the speaker's father is reduced to the foreign Lettish, is that what it's called? The Lithuanian?
Lettish. Well, that's the language. I think I'm right in saying that he's either from Lithuania or from Estonia. Both the language being spoken in both countries. So we're not quite sure which, but an East European country.
And
Yes.
he's reduced in his illness after having been mugged to just these few words of English and his native tongue. And then the speaker is he's nothing if not a polyglot of sorts. His English vocabulary is Anthony Hecht's vocabulary, huge vocabulary. This may be.
Well, of course, we're told that he excelled at school, and that he excelled in English in particular, winning spelling competitions and doing very well with his essays. And it's clear that even in his teenage years, he's reading John Stuart Mill and others. So we're well prepared for the vocabulary with which he addresses us.
Partly a reaction to immigration,
Quite possibly,
and to having no language, really.
Yes.
I'll show you. Yeah.
Isn't it interesting when you just start to talk about a poem like this? Because people often don't know what the fuss is about poetry. They just say, it sounds fine. But when you drill into it, even in this little space that we've given ourselves, you really think, I could not have written that, something so coherent at such levels, where an allusion is not just a sort of bit of clever sort of wordplay, but a deep part of its structure. I think people don't read very deeply, so they're not really quite seeing just how good this is,
And it adds to one's awe in this instance to know that this poem was written in the space of 2 months.
Wow, God.
Given the complexity of it, the sheer density of the poem, one would easily imagine it taking years, not a matter of months.
Yeah.
How long did it take Rilke to do the Duino elegies? Not much longer than that. And meanwhile, he wrote the sonnets to Orpheus also. So,
well, we go back to Maitreyabandhu's point about genius being involved here. It's hard not to use that
You
word.
need another category, don't you? That you just couldn't do that. Let's go back to the Book of Ephraim. I can't remember how
I
long that
didn't
took,
read.
and let's go to this a section that you really draw out in your annotations of in your book, Stephen. You know, you've really helped
Yes.
me understand it, because some of the Book of Ephraim is not at all easy. I've read it, I think, 4 times now. I've read The Changing Light twice or 3 times now, and it's 520 pages long. So it's got. But there's some bits that are really quite difficult. You know, the bits we've highlighted are some of the more straightforward parts. Merrill can be, you know, really quite difficult, as well as then being quite silly.
Well, you know, there's a whole section of his career before Ephraim in which he was heavily influenced by the French poets, and especially Mallarmé. And Mallarmé's kinds of connections among words are the epitome of a kind of obscure but grand poetry. And Mallarmé was about as important to Merrill as Proust was. So there are in his middle books, I think Merrill was heavily influenced in some of those difficult but wonderful poems, like The Friend of the Fourth Decade,
Yeah.
and others, by symbolism, by French symbolism. And the passage in W, I think it was, you wanted me to look at?
X, I think.
Oh, X, excuse me, thank you. Yes.
X-ray, of course.
Yes, X-ray. Um, yeah. Um, yeah. Let me see is there anything I want to say about this? That's interesting. We're skipping W, is that right?
We're skipping W, I think so, yeah.
Okay, very
Oh,
good,
yeah, I think
very good.
I meant to have W, perhaps we haven't got time for W, but anyone
No,
thinking you must read W.
it's all right. We'll do X.
Okay.
Okay. But I'll point out that W is all in terza rima,
Yeah.
and it's a wonderful terza rima. I remember James telling me in a letter that he had committed a terrible sin when he was writing the section in W, the terza rima, that he had used a rhyme again. He used the rhyme twice. And he said, which Dante, of course, never did. And so he went back and he found a new rhyme. So there are no overlapping rhymes in W now. Anyway, section X, beginning what I think I feel now.
Yes, that's what I was thinking. That's it.
Okay. Okay, well, this is in a sense, I think it's the end of the romantic quest. This moment of it would maybe substitute for the escape in Hecht, the living in the present tense without recourse to the past or the future or anything. But for Merrill, it's different. It's a discovery of a force, a life force. I'm gonna read. I'm not gonna read. I'm sorry. There's so much to say about the section. I'm just gonna read the section. Okay. What I think I feel now, by its own nature, remains beyond my power to say outright. Now, he's doing something prosodically here, which is of note. He's been writing in pentameter, and he switches now to an 11-syllable line, which gives him more of a feel of a flow, as one thing flows into another here in this section. remains beyond my power to say outright, short of grasping the naked current where it flows through field and book. Now, the current is a phrase that has come up. It's one of those motifs throughout the Book of Ephraim. Sometimes it's an electrical current. Sometimes it's the current of water, a stream. And in both cases, it's identified with the power that runs through everything. There's a phrase that he alludes to once, probably from Pascal, though there are other possible sources, definition of God, whose circumference is nowhere, but whose center is everywhere. That's God. There's no circumference, but the center is everywhere. This center is what he means, one of the things that he means when he talks about the naked current here. He has come to the point where he feels that he can almost say what it is that is at the center of things, which is kind of like God. The naked current where it flows through field and book alike. The natural world, the book that he is writing, dog howling, the firelit glances, the caresses, whatever it draws us to and insulates us from the absolute. So that's what the naked current is. The absolute, which you can't grasp, of course. You would electrify yourself. But it's whatever draws us to, yet insulates us from the absolute. And then it strikes Merrill that the absolute is a kind of musical instrument. The absolute. The absolute, which wonderfully, this slow December noon of clear blue time zones flown through toward relatives and friends. He's been on an airplane. More and more sounds like the kind of pear-bellied early instrument, the lute, of course, skills all but lost or wanted, or the phoenix quill of passion to pluck a minor scale from and to let the silence after each note sing. So time has, but who needs that nom de plume? He's thinking back about Cavafy's, which he's quoted, Cavafy's gloss on Ruskin. Cavafy says about Ruskin that we don't need to personify time. We know time. We are time. We grow old. We have our own scythe in our hand. We turn into the skull. We are time. Time, time is another word for the absolute. It's a big jump, but the poem makes it. But time has, but who needs that nom de plume? The plume picking up the quill, of course, from the preceding lines. We've modulated. Keys ever remoter lock our friend, at Ephraim, among the golden things that go without saying, the loves no longer called up or named. We've grown autumnal, mild. We've reached a stage through him that he will never himself reach. Ephraim is retiring from the poem now. Back underground he sinks, a stream, the latest recurrent figure out of mythology, to lend his young beauty to a living grave in order that earth bloom another season. Shall I come lighter-hearted to that springtide, knowing it must be fathomed without a guide? Fathomed because of the current, the guide, Ephraim, Virgil, his Virgil, or Beatrice maybe, gone now, no longer to guide him. With no one, nothing along those lines, or these lines, whose writing, if not justifies, so mirrors, so embodies up to now some guiding force, Ephraim Hermes, it can't simply be written off. In neither the world's poem nor the poem's world. As Mallarmé has said, it's as though the world should end in a great book. The world's poem nor the poem's world have I learned to think for myself much. The twinklings of insight hurt or elude the naked eye, no metrical lens to focus them. This is an apology for poetry, for prosody, for meter. The twinklings of insight need the metrical lens to focus them. No kismet, veiled as a stern rhyme sound, to obey whose wink floods with rapture its galaxy of sisters. Muse and maker, each at loss without the, oh, but my foot has gone to sleep. And now the hendecasyllabic line will give way, because that one foot has gone to sleep, to pentameter. It takes its time. We get 5, 6. The next line is a hexameter, with ending gingerly, but then the next line works its way back to pentameter, and by the time he gets to of reawakening, recirculation, he's back in the pentameter line. Pulsars intuiting the universe once more. So this net of loose talk, that is to say, the hendecasyllabics, tightening to verse, which is to say the pentameter. So anyway, he's had this little digression out where he feels the contact through the verse with what is this absolute. So anyway, that's one of several climaxes here towards the end, and it's Merrill in a very different mode, a Mallarméian mode. Quite a sharp contrast too.
It's also a really good, I think, a really good example of how Merrill can, he's got this jokiness, this wit, this sophistication, this warmth, and then he can draw it all together into verse of really quite spectacular beauty, I find. Again and again, he'll actually manage to lift the verse to a higher level, but he's done so much joking and kind of wrong-footing you that you'll go with him. Auden famously said that when poets raise their voice, they sound false, wasn't it? They sound phony. That's right. Merrill, by all of his tricks, can then end up raising his voice or raising the level of the writing into this quite exquisite kind of writing, which, all the way through the Changing Light at Sandover, you get these moments of what I feel like pure beauty. Like, he's often thought of as being a Mozartian poet, they're like snow crystals, like beautifully formed, formal beauty. You see it all the way through his writing, don't you? This ability to draw his talents together into this sort of beautiful speech.
He's much more Mallarmé and Mozart than he is the campy, funny guy, I think.
Yes, I think people miss that. They miss that modulation into that. At least some of my friends have missed it anyway.
Yeah. You can't underestimate. Can't overestimate, I think. I mean, the power that Mallarmé had over Merrill, and Mozart, of course, was. I mean, it was one of his heroes.
But we better draw to a close. So let's hear one of the last sections of the Venetian Vespers, and then I'll just see whether I can get the two of you just to make one or two more comments. But there's so much more I'd like to go into, and so many more questions that I'd got written down I was going to go into. But let's hear this incredible piece of writing there late in this poem.
Well, the passage you'd like me to read is is what follows on from the passage that Stephen quoted earlier, the one in which the quote from Hamlet appears. So this thought which has surfaced and which represents the centre of the poem, the climax, as it were, that maybe his uncle and his mother had had an affair, and just possibly he was the product of that affair. It gives way to another of the speaker's attempts to distract himself, to put the horror of that thought or those thoughts behind him. And if it's okay with you, Maitreyabandhu, I'll just read the lines preceding the passage you asked me to. In these late days, I find myself frequently at the window, its glass a cooling comfort to my temple, and I lift up mine eyes, not to the hills, of which there are not any, but to the clouds. Here is a sky determined to maintain the reputation of Tiepolo, a moving vision of a shapely mist, full of the splendour of the insubstantial. Against a diorama of palest blue cloud curds, cloud stacks, cloud bushes sun themselves, giant confections, impossible meringues, soft coral reefs and powdery tumuli pass in august processions and calm herds. Great stadiums, grandstands and amphitheatres, the tufted, opulent litters of the gods they seem, all laundered bunting, well-dressed wigs, harvests of milk-white Chinese peonies that visibly rebuke our stinginess. For all their ghostly presences, they take on a colourful nobility at evening. Off to the east, the sky begins to turn lilac, so pale it seems a mood of grey. Gradually, like the death of virtuous men, streaks of electrum richly underline the slow, flat-bottomed hulls, those floated lobes between which quills and spokes of light fan out into carnelian reds and nectarines. Nearing a citron brilliance at the centre, the searing furnace of the glory hole that fires and fuses clouds of muscatel with pencillings of gold. I might just conclude with the next two lines, which immediately precede the end of the poem. I look and look as though I could be saved simply by looking. But of course he can't be.
No.
It's a remarkable passage, I think.
Oh,
the descriptive powers on display there are astonishing, such as to make you look at clouds quite differently. Yeah, I know some people have misgivings about what they call the high style in Hecht, and
Merrill
even. And Merrill too, of course. And I remember not quite crossing swords with Sandy McClatchy over this, but certainly disagreeing with him, because I think Sandy didn't much care for it in Hecht's poems. And it describes such passages as, and he was thinking of this one in particular, as baroque and indeed empurpled. And sought to explain this away to himself, because he was a great admirer of Hecht's work, sought to explain that on the grounds that it was a deliberate attempt to demonstrate that something was about to go wrong, that these passages were somehow themselves insubstantial, to use a word that's used by Hecht of the clouds. This I never could accept.
Did he mean go wrong in the character, the speaker?
Well, no. I think what well, yes. Sorry, Stephen. I think the answer to that question must be yes. That I mean, the quote, if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. Sandy, in a fine essay, a tribute to Hecht, writes, "The extravagance of the high style in a Hecht poem should signal some unknowing desperation, some pride before a fall." And I think if one looks through all of the poems in which the high style makes its presence felt. It would be hard to justify this claim. It's certainly not true that it always betokens or presages some fall. I think we have to take Hecht at his own word. I mean, there's a place in his conversation with Lanny Hammer, who I know you've had on PoetryEast before, an interview that took place in 1996, and he was asked about his love for the more gorgeous, the more ornamental verse that he would sometimes indulge in, and he said this to Lanny, and it's always struck me as something to counter Sandy's take on things. Venice was as important to me as the speaker was, and every once in a while I wanted to get in some gorgeous descriptive effects of what clouds look like, or what a rainstorm looks like in the city. And I wasn't going to let anything stand in the way of those little fanfares of description. There you have it. Little fanfares of description. All by itself, that is a little fanfare of description. Right, yeah. But I think it demonstrates that Hecht didn't, I mean, that he loved writing in this way and was seeking opportunities to introduce it. Of course, it may be associated, and in this case is associated, with the speaker's wish to be free of the intestinal wormings of his brain. But this isn't true everywhere in Hecht's writing. One can find a good many instances of this of the fanfares of description which aren't associated with any fall from grace or the presage of some disaster.
Absolutely, I see no reason why both things can't be true. I think, given this speaker, given his loneliness and his despair, it makes sense to me that this language should kind of be his out, his escape, the one thing he can depend upon or enjoy for the moment. That could be true. It could also be true that Hecht, who was not in despair, who was not perverse about this, enjoyed describing things.
Yeah.
Word painting, as Merrill says, quoting somebody else about his own work. Yes, if you can use language like that, there may be different motivations for it.
I do find that very interesting, because I think there's a general sort of dogma that's arisen in poetry, which is that the high style mustn't be used. That it slightly reminds me of Derek Walcott is often criticised for being florid, overcooked and so on. But he clearly experiences the world as being very beautiful, and there's a tendency to think of beauty as always a lie or a bit of clever thing to do something. Both Hecht and Merrill want to, it seems to me, say yes, the world has got terrible things, but it also has this beauty, and that requires praise just as much as horrors require examination.
I think that's true. Yeah, I think they are both great appreciators of the world as it is. They find beauty in the most unexpected places, partly because they pay so much attention to detail, both of them, and details exfoliate for them. They unfold. They look harder and harder at things, and pretty soon you're looking at the whole world.
Yeah, maybe I could just very briefly quote from an early essay of Anthony Hecht's. This is from the preface to the collected poems I've edited. Anthony Hecht once wrote that poems can allow us to contemplate our sweetest triumphs and our deepest desolations, and by employing the manifold devices of art, recover for us what he memorably called the inexhaustible plenitude of the world. I think it's a remarkable description. I think this dates all the way back to, I think, 1966. But it gave us to understand exactly what he thought poetry was capable of, and what he demonstrated it was capable of.
And I really like that phrase, remarkable plenitude of the world. You know, there's no reason not to keep faith with that. You know, both Hecht and Merrill are only too aware of the ugliness of the world, but it's not that ugly doesn't cancel out the remarkable plenitude, beauty, and apparent order of the world. It's too easily disavowed, and it hasn't been in our interests, I don't think, to disavow that. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you both today was that, primarily I think these are two great poems that deserve to be read by any serious reader. One of the sadnesses about poetry now, it's become too niche. You know, I know many people who read, very serious novels, but still don't read poetry at all. Anyone that's sort of any like a serious person, that old-fashioned idea of a serious person who, both of these poems offer everything, but also both of these poems, to use those words, rejoice in in the beauty of the world, in this remarkable plenitude.
Yes, it's it takes patience, poetry. Valerie's wonderful poem, which Merrill translated, Palm, about the palm tree, which is about the poet, about the artist. It's patience, patience, patience dans les jours, chaque atome de silence est la chance d'un fruit mûr. Patience is the thing. Rilke was a great exponent of patience too. You have to be patient. You have to take your time. Every moment is an atom of silence. And people aren't so patient these days, and there's so much that needs to be said. Apparently. And you're right, it is a niche thing. It's many niches, I think.
Yeah.
There are these, and people read in those niches, but they don't take their time with the details of the poets that we have in mind today. This is the way old fogies talk. And I know that. But still, we do have ups and downs in the history of poetry. I think this is a down.
Right, yeah. Yes, indeed.
I don't think it's gone forever, but...
So look, we better finish there, because in a way, what I hope that the viewers will find, meeting the two of you and meeting your relationship with Hecht and Merrill, that'll help them into those two great poems, the Venetian Vespers and the Book of Ephraim, and then they need to go on from that to the whole body of work. There's so much. Both of them give you so much to enjoy, except for enjoy is too slight a word. They deepen your perception of being, don't they? They enrich your sense of being in the world. And that's easily used as a kind of strapline for poetry. But these two poets, in these two poems, really, really do that. So I want to thank you both very much, not only for this conversation, and I'd love to just carry on and on, but for all the work you've done, the editing you're doing. I presume you finished now for the collected poems and all the
proofreading.
Sorry,
we're proofreading
in the proofreading stage, so that's a big stage as well. And for your work, Stephen, all of your work annotating Merrill, presenting Merrill to us, that lovely volume of letters that we've just feels to me fairly recently had. So I want to thank you both very much, and I hope that this conversation between us will set all these readers off in the direction of James Merrill and Anthony Hecht.
I
Thank
can
you very
say
much.
that the editing on the letters was, that's largely Lanny Hammer, too,
Yeah,
who had a
indeed.
big hand
Yeah,
in
yeah,
that ed.
yeah. We've referenced him.
Anyway, this has been wonderful for me. I've really enjoyed
Me
it.
too.
I've discovered things. You've told me things, and I feel like going and writing an essay on these two poems.
No one needs to, don't they?
I'll quote you both. So
Thank you
thank
very much,
you.
both of
Thank
you.
you, Mr.
Yeah,
Bender.
thank
Thank
you.
you very
Thank you.
much.